this is the first now of the 8 poetry revision videos. I'm going to start each one with the writing a poetry essay mind map, which you should have. If you don't forget, if you're looking for notes, pmcbrunner at iCloud, you'll be able to email me, and hopefully you might find this video useful. So remember, when you're looking at revising your poets, they're going to ask you about language. This map, I've taken out some of the wording from previous exams where they've asked you to comment on things like whether or not the language is vivid, or, so I can put a light on here, or evocative or provocative, use of natural imagery or powerful language. So you have to be able to talk about what the poet, how the poet writes. You know, what does it mean when they ask, is their approach to language unique? What is a narrative scene and how can it be effectively employed by a poet? What does it mean when it says that the poet uses language to transform the familiar into the mundane? So that's, you know, for certain that no matter who you write about next June, no matter what of the 8 poets you're writing about, there's going to be a wording in the question to do with the way they write, their style of writing, engaging, dated, appealing, these kinds of words. You also know that they're going to ask you to write about the content of the poet's work, okay? And the thematic concerns, and you're going to have to deal with, wording like this, which would be a little bit more specific usually than the style wording. So, a poet's fascination with life and its rich experiences, or how the poet offers profoundly insightful lessons into human nature, or profound lessons, or how the work is intellectually stimulating or thought-provoking, or how the work can be challenging to read, which means, both in terms of language, but also in terms of the ideas presented to us, whether the themes discussed are relevant to contemporary Ireland. So remember, before I get into the first of these the revision mind maps, they're all designed to help you not only revise the poet pretty quickly, but also to keep in mind what you're being examined on. You're being examined on your analytical skills. You're being examined, don't forget, through the poets, not on the poets. Very important to get that in your head. So it's not the individual poet really that is being examined. It's your ability to talk about a statement relating to that poet's work and their style of writing and the content of their poetry, and to use your knowledge of that poet's work to support your point of view. So we're going to start with Derek Mahon, and I'm going to do a map on all of these. And I think this is the time of year now, when I gave you these maps earlier on in the year, or when you got them, you might have looked at them and gone, oh, well, yeah, I don't know how to use them. But now that you've covered the material, you need to go back over it. You need to make sure you have it sharp and tight in your mind, and that's what this is for. So I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. So Mahon, of course, like every other poet, there's 12 poems prescribed by Mahon on the course. I only look at 6, 7 in class, but you can look at, and you can look at any selection of them. One of the poems I don't look at in class is called Dishu Shed in County Wexford. It's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant poem. It's just very dense, very heavy, and in a year where usually I only have 1 year to go through the whole course, I tend to avoid it when it's on. But this is a great quote, great introduction to Mahon. Even now there are places where a thought might grow. It's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant quote. And for me, it really captures the essence of Mahon's poetry. He's a writer whose work is designed to be thought-provoking. He's a writer whose work is all about exploring and trying to understand the human experience and different perspectives on the human experience. And when you read his work, there's no question whatsoever, no matter what poem you read, it is deeply and often memorably thought-provoking. These are the 6 poems I teach by Mahon. Remember, there are other poems on the course as well. This is a general overview, but I focus on the 6 poems I teach. And I suppose the first thing to remember, he's a narrative poet. So that means he's a poet who writes poems which contain stories. Each poem on the course by Mahon features a little scenario. And that means there are characters and setting descriptions. So, whether it be the fanatic in As It Should Be, or Lawrence Oates in Antarctica, or Bruce Ismay in After the Titanic, or Swar Lapui in Rathlin, or the proprietor of the restaurant in the Chinese restaurant in Port Rush, there's usually quite a distinctive pen portrait character at the heart of Mahon's poems. And the poems are not about those characters, but Mahon uses those characters to explore his themes in an interesting way. And that's what the narrative does. The narrative is accessible, easy to follow, easy to understand, involving, and immerses the reader into the poem, and thereby makes the thematic points Mahon is making more interesting. We know that he is really quite masterful when it comes to the word evocative, provoking the imagination, and, bringing scenes to life and atmospheres to life. And, we look at the sinking of the Titanic in that poem, the Antarctic tundra in the poem, in the poem of that title, Antarctica, the rural landscape in As It Should Be, the Rathlin Island, both in the modern world as a nature reserve, but also in 400 years ago as the site of a massacre. He brings places to life, and that's a particularly notable feature of his poetry. And if you are talking about Mahon and you're going poem by poem, use that idea of the narrative approach, the striking characters, the distinctive set and description to link your poems together. Or you can write about these things as separate units in an essay where you're not going poem by poem, but you're going idea by idea. His poetry often features specific scenarios. So, Bruce Ismay's story, Lawrence Oates' last moments, the murder of a mad bastard by a bigot, tied up swings on shipyard silence on a Sunday in Belfast. He brings these kind of specific small stories to life in a way which is very vivid, and makes his work quite striking and memorable. He deals with universal themes. All poets do. While all poetry is by its nature personal, really interesting poetry has to speak to the reader, has to have a message that goes beyond the particulars of the poet. And there is no doubt that when you read a Mahon poem, you're looking at, as I said earlier on, lots of different insights into the human experience that are utterly relatable, from personal failure to regrets, our capacity for heroism and also for weakness, the reality of violence and a willingness to use violence to assert your will, the reality of bigotry and discrimination, and indeed identity, the sense of who we are, which is brilliantly brought to life in the Chinese restaurant in Portrush. So a great thing to say about Mahon is that his poems offer a different or unique perspective on familiar subjects and events. So, we've all heard of the Titanic, but when you read after the Titanic and you learn the story of Bruce Ismay, and you're left wondering whether or not the poet sees Ismay as a sympathetic figure or whether or not you do as a reader. That's fascinating, because again, it illustrates how human beings are flawed, yes, but also how when we hear their stories, we have different perspectives on and different we judge them differently based on our own experiences or the way they're presented in that poem. So brilliant writer. We know, as I said to you before, for every one of these mind maps that I'm going to look at with you, learn a metaphor or a symbol from each poem. Have that as a link. So when you're discussing the poems, talk about the narrative style, talk about the universal themes, but also talk about the mastery over symbolism. Great poets create, striking, complex, thought-provoking metaphors and symbols that have to be understood for the poem to unravel. And there's so many in Mahon's poetry, and the appeal of that is it adds depth and intrigue to the poems. I got an email from one of you guys during the week asking me about the extent to which you engage on a personal level in an essay. And of course, you do have to engage intellectually on a personal level with the material. That doesn't mean talking about, and it made me feel sad, or it inspired me. That's all a lot of nonsense. Leave all that out. But to be talking about how, reading this poem, if they say, for example, the poet's style is appealing or indeed dated, you say, no, I don't feel it's dated at all, because, the poems are filled with these striking metaphors and symbols which add depth and intrigue to the poems, and therefore and need to be interpreted, and therefore make the poems more interesting and challenging to read. That's personal response without overusing the I personal pronoun or the me personal pronoun. And there are so many. I would highly recommend you start learning, if you're preparing Mahon, like 3 or 4 of these images. So the image from After the Titanic of the tide leaves broken toys and hat boxes silently at my door. It's a brilliant metaphor to capture the reality of trauma. The tide is not leaving hat boxes and broken toys at his door every day. It's just that every morning when he wakes up, that's what he's been dreaming about. He's haunted by that event. So that poem, in that one image, in that one symbol, in that one metaphor, Mahon is challenging us to think about Bruce Ismay, who was seen as the villain of the piece, as a more nuanced and human and maybe sympathetic character. In Rathlin, one of my favourite images from Rathlin is the image of the lighthouse. A lone light that repeats one simple statement to the turbulent sea. Now that is a great example of metaphor. Because on a literal level, he's talking about a lighthouse on Rathlin Island that warns shipping of rocks. But he's actually using that as a metaphor for the island itself and its historical significance. Because on that island, there was a sectarian slaughter. And what he's saying is we have to heed the message of history if we are not going to bring ourselves up on the rocks in the present day. He lived in a Northern Ireland that was riven by sectarian hatred and violence, and he was able to look at the past and see where that ends up. It ends up in butchery and cruelty and terrible suffering. So that lone light is a brilliant metaphor for the importance of learning from the past so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past in the modern world. Ecclesiastes again contains one of the great metaphors. He says that in order to go back to his people, to become, to go home, he would have to bury that red bandana and stick that banjo. And particularly the red bandana is a symbol of his individuality. He's an artist. He's a man who is interested in the world and, the heat of the world, as he says in that poem. And that's his identity. That's who he is. But if he was going to go back to his culture, his people, his community, he would have to, subvert who he is. And that idea of being expected to bury part of who we are in order to be accepted, that's not only particular to Mahon in that poem, but is utterly relatable to so many readers in the modern world. The solitary enzyme, magnificent, just concise, unusual adjective noun combination. Enzymes are part of a chain, of a list. Like we're all part of the human, family. But that, Lawrence Oates at that moment was just on his own. Nobody could have helped him. He was on his own in the moments before he died. And you just have this image of, it conjures up for me this kind of cinematic image of the speck of humanity in the vast tundra of the Antarctic, the frozen wastes of the Antarctic. This tiny, tiny, tiny living part of our human family at that last moment. Not a fool, but a man to admire for the sacrifice that he did, or the sacrifice that he gave to try and save his friends. I love, in As It Should Be, let us hear no idle talk of the moon in the Yellow River. And of course, it's a difficult image, but essentially the moon in the Yellow River is a reference to philosophy. And the most important part of that image is the idle talk. Like that's a fantastic, like if you learn the red bandana, if you learn the word idle talk, if you learn solitary enzyme, like learn the small parts of the quotes, the lone light representing the warning, the turbulent sea representing troubled times, the broken toys and hat boxes. These are all easy to learn quotes that will allow you to really get under the skin of the poet's work and talk about his mastery and his imagination, and how there's a depth and a nuance to his work which rewards repeated reading and so on. But that idea of this particular speaker, the fanatic, he doesn't want to hear. He thinks talk is idle, waste of time, lazy. He doesn't want to discuss morality. He doesn't want to discuss whether the rights and wrongs of whether he harmed this person he kills and calls a mad bastard. He, as far as he's concerned, he's right and everybody else is wrong. And that's a brilliant metaphor for ignorance, And Mahon is shining a light, excuse the pun, into that ignorance in that poem. In The Chinese Restaurant in Portrush, just the ideogram and the sea cloud, this connection between, the ideogram is a reference to Chinese writing, the use of symbols in Chinese writing. You have this wonderful image of a sail there, which represents, the new identity of that man. He's Chinese, but he's living in Portrush. He's an emigrant and an immigrant. He's somebody who is Irish, but also Chinese, and he has that mixed culture. And there's this sense in that image of something beautiful in his, identity at that moment. It's a brilliant symbol, brilliant metaphor, thought-provoking, challenging, really difficult to interpret. I often read these poems and I could come up with a different interpretation sometimes, but that's what you're going to say, that the presence of metaphors and symbols in a poet's work adds a depth to it. That means it's not simple, it's not superficial, it's not one-dimensional, has substance. There's so many examples. The similes, learn a couple of the similes. In the same poem, the proprietor of the Chinese restaurant stands there as if the world were young. Gorgeous. In Rathlin, ages of this till the report of an outboard motor at the pier fractures the dream time and we land as if we were the first visitors here. This idea of, we feel as if we're the first to do stuff and we ignore the fact that there's a long history that's gone before us. Probably the most famous simile, if you're doing Mahon, is the ending of After the Titanic. My poor soul screams out in the starlight. The sibilance there, soul screams starlight, but then heart breaks loose and rolls down like a stone. Fantastic imagery. And what does it mean? His heart breaking loose, and the hardness and the texture and the lack of vitality of a stone. A stone and a heart should be two separate things because the heart is alive and vibrant and pumping and living, but the stone it has no life. And is that talking about what the trauma does to a person? That it makes you, it kills you from the inside out. Does it add humanity to our discussion of the character? It certainly does. It's a striking simile. It's open to interpretation. It's vivid and unusual, making the ending of the poem very, very, very memorable. So think about, as I said, his narrative style, the universal themes, the use of symbolism, the use of similes, but also think about his ability to bring, to appeal to the senses. Like, he uses onomatopoeia so well in his poetry. You could write a whole paragraph just on this now. Again, you can go poem by poem and link these things together. But look out for examples and learn some examples of his use of onomatopoeia, which appeals to the oral or auditory senses. The thundering of the ship as it breaks up and After the Titanic, the whistle and chatter of the birds and in Rathlin, and the screams of the women as they're being slaughtered, and the roar of the sea in the same poem. It's so evocative. The howling snow in Antarctica is so evocative as well. And that, use of whistles, a little tune in After the Titanic, in Chinese Restaurant in Portrush, somehow capturing the kind of positive outlook and the sense of optimism of the man as he looks out from his restaurant across the oceans. Then the heavy washing flaps in the housing estates in Ecclesiastes. These are all excellent examples of onomatopoeia, which show that Mahon is a writer who's able to appeal to, create sensual imagery and appeal to the senses, especially the auditory or oral sense. He also makes use of sibilants to add a often thoughtful and quite quiet tone to the poems. There's so many great examples. The air blows softer since his departure, the numb self-sacrifice of the weakest, the dark churches, the empty streets, the shipyard silence, the tied-up swings is probably my favourite one from his poetry. So be able to talk about how the poems are interesting because they explore themes which get to the heart of human nature, but they're also just as interesting because of his mastery over language and his use of techniques like onomatopoeia to appeal to the oral sense or the auditory sense, like sibilants to create an atmosphere and influence the tone and the mood of the poem, like similes to create vivid imagery, like metaphors and symbols to not only create imagery but also to challenge us to think. And then as a storyteller, what am I always telling you about stories? Stories have to have interesting openings. Look at the opening lines of Mahon's poems. There's so many of them. I am just going outside and shall be. Sorry, I'm just going outside and. I can't remember the rest of the line. But there's so many really, really brilliant opening lines in Mahon's poetry. Just look at each opening line and be able to write a paragraph maybe, or write a link between that. As a storyteller, he grabs your attention. And, we hunted the mad bastard. That's the opening line of As It Should Be. They said I got away in a boat and humbled me at the inquiry. There's so many brilliant and carefully crafted opening lines in his poetry. He uses contrast and juxtaposition extremely effectively. The effect of that is to startle the reader, create emphasis, draws into the story, or make the story more impactful. And often when he's looking to really, really hammer home a point, to really emphasize a point, to really, make a line stark and striking, he will use words of one syllable. This is as it should be, from that poem. A long time since the last scream cut short, from Rathlin. God, you could do it. God help you. And that use of monosyllabic language brings, again, a great emphasis, a focus onto what the poet is saying in those particular lines. He also was a poet who, technically extremely gifted. Use of villanelle in Antarctica, meter throughout the poetry, very, very controlled. All of those techniques, including the cacophony when he's describing the breakup of the Titanic, in the opening sequence of that poem, with the prams, pianos, sideboards, winches, boilers bursting, shredded ragtime. That's amazing, amazing line. So that's Mahon. What is he? He's a poet who writes in a narrative style, whose poems are populated by interesting and carefully drawn characters, who are placed into scenarios where there's very definite settings. Those settings are brought to life through skills like onomatopoeia, simile, and sibilance. And he's a writer who uses metaphors and symbols, as well as monosyllabic language and juxtaposition, to draw emphasis onto the points that he's making in the poetry. And the most important thing you're going to say about Mahon, is that his work is, when you read a Mahon poem, it makes you think, and it makes you think about the nature of human existence. That's a decent enough little bit of revision. If you knew what was on that map, you'd be set for any essay on him.